Good morning and welcome. Come and take a seat, and if you're online, get yourself comfortable. We're going to continue with our morning together. Come and draw in as we start. Welcome, my name's Sam, and it's a real pleasure to be sharing the message with you this morning. Hopefully you start to warm up a bit now. Pretty chilly start to the day. But I don't know if you, like me, the last couple of weeks, your email inbox has been bombarded by offers of huge discounts coming up in the Black Friday sales. Maybe it's just me who every day seem to get piles of emails through offering all sorts of special early access offers. Well, never mind the huge percentage discounts that may have been dangled in front of you. I want to share my special inside trick, which you'll have to save for next year's Black Friday, I'm afraid, of how to save a whopping 100% on all potential offers. And I have to say that I have discovered, for all the things that I avoided buying, for everything that I didn't get sucked into on those tantalizing clickbait emails, that I have saved a total, absolute 100% of all the money that I would have spent on those things. I have managed to save all of it by not buying those things. So that's a really fantastic, hopefully, tip that you can save and use next year. But that aside, Jenny and I have been part of New Life Church since we first moved to Letchworth, which was in 2013, which seems quite a long time ago now as the years kind of roll by. But the first time we visited was Easter Sunday that year, and it was a few months before we were able to actually move, and we connected with New Life Church online through some of the podcasts, and we just came down to check it out. We hadn't been to any other churches, and we met in Howard Hall. I remember distinctly us all trundling there with just two little kiddies at that time, and immediately we just felt a sense of home. I mean, I know there's lots of other great churches in and around Letchworth, but for us, New Life Church just felt like our home, and we have felt at home and part of the community ever since. And we made a big move where we were living in Loughborough. We'd been there for just over 10 years. We both arrived there as students at university, met one another, got married, had our first child there as well. And we made a big move down here, mainly for kind of work reasons. But what we've come to discover is that in the midst of that process and those decisions, that God has been totally involved and working, even though sometimes we might not have been aware of it. And sometimes we don't see God's work in our life immediately. Sometimes we don't feel him right there. But in our story, he definitely has. And we'd love to share that story with you sometime. And it reminds me of what Paul wrote in a letter to the church, recording the book of Ephesians, where he says this: "Then Christ will make his home in your hearts as you trust in him." As you trust in him, Christ makes his home in your hearts. And sometimes it takes just as much trust or even more trust to stay and not to go somewhere, to decide not to get involved or take up some new opportunities, not always about what seems perhaps the more exciting options. And there's just perhaps a few moments of my story. That's what we're looking at this morning. We've been looking through this series through November of Remember and Remembrance. And this morning we're going to be thinking about our stories. But there's many more years to tell than I can just sum up in that moment. And each year that passes adds new pages to that book. Some that I'm really excited about, and some that I know if I go back to and turn over, I would be not so keen to be remembering and reliving some of those moments. But a little bit more about me. I was born just before Christmas, 1983. There's a few pictures. My mum managed to dig out of the family photo album. I was the second in line. My elder sister, 3.5 years older than me, who's always, at least thought she's been the boss. But both my parents, very bright and well educated. My father, an engineer, and mum was a linguist. And I think where I was born was on this hilltop farm in Lancashire, probably pretty bleak this time of year. In fact, most of my memory is pretty bleak most times of the year. But by the age of 9, I'd been to 3 different primary schools, moved from the northwest down to the Cotswolds, and then over to Suffolk, so kind of a big triangle round the country. Not through particularly great moments, really, as my family broke up and changed, and I had to adjust to new schools and new friends, new homes, new playgrounds, and sharing those homes with new families. It was a great period of change and upheaval in my life. And I'd definitely say I was very shy, didn't want to make a fuss, hated any kind of confrontation, either myself with other people or just being in the midst of confrontation was very unsettling. And I'd say a definite introvert with my emotions. Everything got bottled up inside. And it'd be fair to say that my heart was pretty torn up in some places. You see, I'm not a finished work by any stretch of the imagination, and neither are you. But I'm also not a failed work, and neither are you. See, God's still working on this canvas, and we might think that sometimes it's a bit of a blank canvas. But I think that God is still working, and he's painting in new bits, and he's restoring areas that got a bit damaged. But I think a lot of the time, just standing back, I imagine him standing back, looking at how things are unfolding. And I like to think actually with a smile of satisfaction on his face. Not focusing on the things that have maybe not gone so well, the decisions that I could have done better in, but looking at me and thinking, it's going well. Sam, it's going well. And I like to think that he would think that of you this morning, wherever you are in your life, in your journey, whether you think it's successful or failed in many ways, that God as a father will look on with love and compassion and think, don't worry about those things. Receive my invitation. I am satisfied with who you really are. As I was saying, it's just a few pages of my story. But I wonder if that's got you interested to hear a bit more. Maybe it's even those few little nuggets have made you think about me a little bit differently. But we all have a story. Everyone has a story. And maybe on first glance we prefer to tell the stories of other people rather than our own. But I think for most people, given the chance, everyone appreciates a moment for somebody to listen to their story. And how powerful that is. Now, stories of real people do keep us hooked and can provide hours of entertainment, whether it's reading biographies, maybe we'll get some of those for Christmas presents this year, listening to interviews or seeing photographs, short video clips, magazine articles, TV documentaries, real-life dramas, reality dramas. There's endless hours of entertainment, and there's always stories, gripping stories about people's lives out there. But they can often seem so more exciting than ours, perhaps. Well, maybe you remember this particular TV series. It was one in which the unsuspecting celebrity was ambushed by the presenter and handed this big red folder and told, "This is your life." And I do remember watching some of these as a child. When I was researching, I was actually shocked how long ago the series began. So there's probably a huge back catalogue to watch. But if you don't recall, it was a show called This Is Your Life with a few kind of iconic presenters. And the celebrity would be given this big red book which said, "This is your life." And it would have all sorts of stories in it, highlights perhaps, or funny moments. And they would invite different key people from that person's life to come and just share a kind of a memory or two. And I always loved how it was always kind of positive. It was honouring that person. Maybe there was some funny mishaps that had gone on, but it was the spirit of it was honouring and celebrating that person's life. And I think it was definitely a popular show because it told someone's story. Well, this morning we're going to look at a short passage from the Bible which gives us a glimpse into a story of someone who probably wouldn't have appeared on this show, who probably wouldn't have had a documentary series made about them or be on the front page of magazines, someone perhaps not so famous. And when we look at the years of Jesus' life ministering to people, it was about 3 years or so, there's so many people that he surprised, from wealthy and powerful to the poor and the diseased, the whole spectrum and range of society at the time. Now, he might not have left them with a big red book, but I'm certain that everyone he met never forgot their encounter with him. And Jesus was so interested in the story of everyone he met, not for entertainment, but so he could shine a light, so he could show them how he featured or could feature in their story. And then he always left them with something, either a direction or a challenge to go away with. This story is recorded in the book of Luke, and we know that Luke was a physician, a doctor, and his persuasion was to research the facts. He would go and speak to people who were eyewitnesses of these different stories and really research those and record those in his gospel, in the Gospel of Luke. And he also travelled with the Apostle Paul on some of his missionary trips, and Luke's credited as the author of the book of Acts as well. And the overarching theme of Luke's writing was to explain that the gospel was now wide open, whereas historically faith and following God was been for the Jewish people. Luke, his overriding message was now it's flung wide open because of the work of Jesus. It's now open to all, Jews and non-Jews. And that's a really helpful filter as we start to look through some of the stories that he recorded. So this story is from Luke chapter 7, and this is how it begins. When one of the Pharisees invited Jesus to have dinner with him, he went to the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. So we'll just take a moment just to take stock of this scene. The Pharisee is one of the Jewish religious elites. And this group, as we read, it's often trying to catch Jesus out, either posing the finer points of Jewish law at Jesus and seeing how he'd respond, or catching him on the Sabbath doing things and say, well, how does this fit with our laws? And they invited Jesus, who was really seen as a bit of a disruptor, but really a nobody teacher from Nazareth, which was really a nowhere town, to his house for dinner. So that's curious and perhaps definitely suspicious. Or in our house, when we're playing the game Among Us, we would just say definitely sus. So that's an interesting start to the opening of this little story. It continues like this. A woman in that town who lived a sinful life learned that Jesus was eating at the Pharisee's house. So she came there with an alabaster jar of perfume. Now we know that Luke was prone to do his research, so the fact that it's recorded that this woman, in quotes, lived a sinful life must have meant that everybody knew what had been going on with this woman. Now we don't know the exact details, but it must have been something that was very outward, that had been exposed, that was known to that community, and therefore someone who would have lived with a lot of shame. But when she hears that Jesus is in town and at somebody's house for a meal, maybe she's thinking, this could be my moment. Maybe not sure my moment quite to do what, but something must have stirred inside of her when she heard that this was happening. She thought, I need to be there. And this is what happens with Jesus. So many stories that we could share amongst our community of people being drawn, not sure why, but drawn. And this reminds me of one of my favourite quotes from C.S. Lewis in his book Surprised by Joy, where he says this: "You must picture me alone in that room at Magdalen, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him who I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England." I just love, he's a great wordsmith anyway, but I just love his description of God's unrelenting pursuit of him. Maybe you'll find that that's part of your story, how God has not given up on you. I want you to know this morning definitely that God has not given up on you and continues to pursue us wherever we are. And the Bible describes this too. If we look in nearly every book, we find moments of God pursuing us. Even in the first book of Genesis, after Adam and Eve have had the apple and turned away from God's instruction, it says, the Lord God called to the man, "Where are you?" He knew where he was, but he was seeking him out. And right from that very moment, God has been coming and pursuing us. So news of Jesus' presence within the town and going to the Pharisees' house must have reached this woman, just as it reaches us this morning. And maybe that's a question for you to consider, or something to answer. The Lord God has called to you. Where are you? Now, just a quick note, we mustn't gloss over this funny name for this jar of perfume, the alabaster jar. Well, if the woman is recorded as leading this sinful life, that would have isolated her from a community. It's not unreasonable to think that she would have been distanced from her immediate family as well, which would, as a woman, certainly in that culture, would have been her prime source of support. So it's reasonable to assume that she would have been someone that didn't have many means. Now, the jar itself is definitely recorded as being a rich marble-type precious stone. And not only that, the perfume within it would have been of great value. Now, the way these jars were designed was sealed from the top, so you had to smash it in order to get the perfume out. So definitely a single-use item, as we might say today. Now, how the woman came to have this jar, we don't know, but the history tells us that this in itself would have been something of great value. And we should start to note the contrasts in this story already coming through. This simple woman, probably very poor, with a precious gift. What's she going to do with it? And on the other side, the self-righteous Pharisee, owner of this house, putting on a meal for the visiting teacher. And we're going to discover how these stories unfold. It continues, "As she stood behind him at his feet weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears. Then she wiped them with her hair, kissed them, and poured perfume on them." We'll just break this down a bit so it doesn't sound too strange or weird. Now, Jesus has been described as reclining at the table. This wouldn't have been on perhaps a nice set of luxury oak furniture land dining chairs. The way they would have sat round that table would have been leaning forwards with their feet out the back, most likely. And it wouldn't have been strange in this household setting to have servants and other people moving around. So perhaps the woman just kind of integrated with the general melee of what was happening. And it wouldn't have been necessarily a strange thing. But the woman somehow, for some reason, is moved to tears in the presence of Jesus. That can be a common experience when people come close to Jesus, moved emotionally into tears. And she uses them to wash his feet. Now, first century Middle Eastern people did travel generally barefoot, or if you were reasonably wealthy, you would have had sandals. And by the end of the day, you would have been very dusty, and who knows what else you would have stood in during that day. They didn't have all kinds of fancy boots or dust-free cross-country trainers on, so their feet were pretty grubby by the end of the day. Now, a good host definitely would have offered to wash guests' feet as they arrived. And we read about this. I mean, Jesus even did it for his own disciples, and you can look that up in the book of John. So it wasn't a weird thing that was going on. The woman's there, she's overcome with emotion as she's near to Jesus, and then decides to wash his feet. And this was an act of hospitality that readers of this story would have known the host had not undertaken. Perhaps we're seeing how the contrast between these two characters is growing ever starker. Now, the perfume itself, as I said, is not like modern perfumes where you have a nice little spray bottle and you can just get a little tester, see if that's the right one. This was definitely an all or nothing moment. Either you had to smash it and use it all, or save it for another moment. And therefore this woman was faced with a big decision. Is today the day that I'm going to go all in? Am I going to smash this and use it all now? or am I going to draw back and wait for another moment? Do I bet big and risk it all? Maybe that's something for us to think about. The story continues. When the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, important here, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who is touching him and what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner. Now, the Pharisee, perhaps his dinner party isn't quite working out how he'd planned, and this moment's getting pretty awkward. But things are often awkward when Jesus was around. I think the Pharisees' angle was checking out Jesus' credentials. I've heard a lot about him, let's have him round. I'll see who he really is and what he's like. But his definite preference was, I'm not going to get my hands dirty. If this man were a prophet, perhaps he's thinking, if you are what everyone says you are, what the hype and hubbub says, and what you claim to be, well, in my worldview, you wouldn't be allowing this to happen. I mean, you would know how this would be perceived. The sinful woman even touching you, never mind crying on you and using her hair and washing your feet and using perfume. I mean, maybe, who knows where she even got that from. I mean, this would not be perceived very well. This isn't how it works in our religious system. You have to clean yourself up, not somebody else does it for you. And once you're clean, you're not going to risk dirtying yourself by getting involved in the lives of others. You're just going to tell them that they need to be as good as you, or they're going to be left behind in the gutter. But it's an interesting phrase, if this man were a prophet. It kind of crops up a few other places in the Gospels. If you are the Son of God, tell this stone to become bread, when Jesus is being tempted. And then at the cross, come down from the cross, if you are the Son of God. It seems like a question that humanity has always wrestled with and continues to ponder about Jesus. If you are who you say you are. Maybe that's a question that you'll be faced with today, and as we head towards Christmas. So I wonder if the Pharisee might have been thinking, I've got this all worked out, but Jesus, clearly you haven't. You haven't got this right. Don't bring those sinful people near to me. Just think of what everybody would say. Now, I pointed out earlier on that Simon, or the Pharisee, it was recorded, he said to himself. You know how sometimes we say things to ourselves, but perhaps a bit louder or more obviously than we think. Because then Jesus continues to say this. Jesus answered him, Simon, I have something to tell you. Now, whether Jesus overheard what he'd been muttering under his breath, or as often is the case, Jesus just got a sense of where his heart was at and realized what he was thinking. But he starts to call him out on it. See how the tables have turned. The Pharisees invited Jesus round to check him out, but actually Jesus is now probing into what's really going on in the Pharisee's heart. So he says, tell me, teacher, he said. I'm not sure what else he could have said at that point. But again, this is starting to get awkward. But as so often happens, Jesus makes his point by telling everyone a short story. And he says this, 2 people owed money to a certain moneylender. One owed him 500 denarii, the other 50. Neither of them had the money to pay him back, so he forgave the debts of both. Now which of them will love him more? Simon replied, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven. Then he turned toward the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I came into your house. You did not give me any water for my feet, but she wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You did not give me a kiss, but this woman, from the time I entered, has not stopped kissing my feet. You did not put oil on my head, but she has poured perfume on my feet. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. But whoever has been forgiven little loves little." Jesus is starting to help Simon the Pharisee with what's going on in his heart. You see, from the outset of the story, we would think, oh, this woman's coming. She's clearly the one in need. And not to say she wasn't in need. But Simon the Pharisee, as it becomes clear, also has a great need. And the two people in the story could easily have been the woman and the Pharisee. They both had a debt, and they both were unable to pay that debt. But this was the Pharisee's stumbling block. Perhaps he thought he'd earned enough through his good deeds, through his righteous living, through all his observance of the religious laws, to outweigh or to equal up all of the wrong things or the difficulties that he perceived in himself. But this story tells us and reminds us that no amount of striving or self-discipline or even observing those laws would be enough. And they had plenty of laws to try and keep up with. They were both in the same position. It's just the woman knew how bad it was, and Simon thought that he was actually just going to save himself. I wonder how often we're divided into such contrasting groups, either feeling low down and defeated, hopeless and broken and a wreck, or feeling pretty good about ourselves because of relative success or popularity or heritage or the ability just not to mess things up in the general view of things. But all of these things are futile when it comes to our hearts. And if we just to take one day, for example, just 24 hours, or if we take up a bit of time for sleep, maybe 16 or 18 hours to make it a bit easier. Now, if I try really hard through those hours, I think I can do a reasonable job of being pleasant or even tempered, loving and caring towards other people. And I can use some of that time to serve others and try not to think about myself too much, but it doesn't usually take much within that time period, even on my best day, for something to happen, whether it's someone comes across my path who's not having such a good day, or things don't go how I'd hoped they would have worked out. Those good efforts quickly vanish away. And as I said, that's on a good day. Jesus drives this point home, emphasizing the contrast. The community had labeled this woman as having led a sinful life. They probably looked up in some degree to the Pharisee. But in Jesus' eyes, it was all the other way round. He didn't see the enormity of her sin as a problem. He actually saw her need for him as a great act of love. The way she served when that's what the host should have done. Actually, it was this Pharisee, who we all thought was the upstanding member of the community, who was in some ways more lost. And I wonder what her story would have been like to listen to had you had a chance to sit down and just let her pour it out. Maybe it was full of brokenness and difficulty and trials. And perhaps I would judge her before taking the time to hear that story. Maybe I would want to steer clear and keep my hands clean of getting involved. Maybe I'll be more like Simon, strutting around my house, inviting people over, look at me, look at my achievements. But Jesus turns it upside down. The sinner, the person who is clearly broken on the outside, becomes the one who actually shows the most care and concern towards him. And he closes this passage out by saying, your sins are forgiven. See, there's hope in this story. Hope for those of us who feel like we're on the outside, that we're too broken to come to Jesus. This shows us that Jesus' arms are wide open for us to approach him. In contrast, the person who's perhaps the most broken on the inside, but hiding behind his self-righteousness, is left to ponder his position. And I don't think Jesus was comparing them in terms of their levels of sinfulness, like here's this lady, she's definitely a 10 pushing an 11, super bad, and well, this guy, he's only kind of a 4, he's doing quite well. I don't think he was looking at it like that. It's clear from this story that both people were in need of that rescuer. And that's the type of community that we want to be here at New Life Church, not judging or comparing to one another, but taking the time to hear one another's stories. And as we hear the stories, don't we begin to understand one another better? And we have moments to speak into where God is at work and develop a greater care for one another. And that we're all in need of God's grace. To live like Jesus is definitely to see things differently. And I hope over these next few weeks, as we try and take time to stop and pause and let his presence move us. Whether we need to lay down our list of achievements and what we think we've managed to do, or whether we feel like we need picking up off the floor, we are all invited. We're invited to bring our story as we get closer to Jesus. And as we do so, I think you'll discover that he is present, he's with you, and he is watching you, over you. And I hope you'll discover that he wants to get past any facade, any front that we might have put up trying to hide what's really going on. And whether you've been a Christian for a number of years like me, whether you're just looking in or just starting out, it's time to revisit that story through these next few weeks as we lead up to Christmas. Take some time to look back on your story of your life and share it with someone. And I believe that today is the day that Jesus wants to know, or you to know, that he can work in your life to bring about healing, just as the woman experienced and just was on offer to that Pharisee as well. See, she had already made that decision to come to Jesus. But God works in many ways, and he knows who we are and approaches us in a sensitive way to us. See, the Pharisee thought he was inviting Jesus round, but actually Jesus was coming to him. You never know when he might turn up at your door. We're going to take a few moments to pause and reflect upon this as we play a song, just to remind us that it's all about Jesus, the rescuer. Now, today could be your first day when you choose to accept his invitation, quite simply to come and follow him. And if you feel stirred by that, I'd love to pray with you. I'll be over the side either during the song or just after we close today. Maybe today you feel like it is your day to lay down your works and your achievements and actually let God into your heart and be embraced by the Father. And you're welcome to come and pray as well, share it with a friend. But let's use this time in these coming weeks to share our stories, and let's ask other people what their stories are so that we can see how God is working amongst us.
Cool. That's a catchy song, hey? Well done. That was awesome, Sam. I don't know if you caught the lyrics for the bridge. I'm just going to read it for you now. Come and be chainless. Come and be fearless. Come to the foot of Calvary. For there is redemption for every affliction here at the foot of Calvary. There's redemption for every affliction here at the foot of Calvary. I don't know your story. You know your story. And I don't know what you're going through or experiencing or facing. But our heart as a local church is to be a place where you can find and follow Jesus. And we would absolutely just love to journey with you. And wherever you found yourself at the table today, as Sam so clearly illustrated, whether you felt like more like the Pharisee who keeps it all together on the outside, or if you felt like the woman who's just falling apart and everybody knows. Wherever you find yourself in that story, know that you're welcome at the table, and we would absolutely love to journey with you. And know that you belong as you learn what you believe. And we love you because Jesus loves you. We've been forgiven much. We can only pass on what we have been given. So it's an absolute joy and a delight. And if we can help in any way, whether you're on site or online watching this morning, if we can help in any way as we pray together and learn what it means to be followers of Jesus, we would absolutely love to journey with you. So please come speak to anybody if you'd like to. No questions off limits. So it'd be great to help if we can in any way. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute delight. Got some fun stuff happening next week. Did we say fun? Yes, we have fun stuff happening next week as well. So it's going to be totally different, and really looking forward to that. If you've got little ones and your children, please cross over the street, collect them, say hello to somebody, grab another coffee, hang out a bit, and whatever you've got going on for this week, be blessed and know that we love you, and it's great to be together again. So take care. See ya.
December to remember?